Welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually, for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan Klein-Hewitt, Adult Services Manager here at Ames Public Library. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like today's event. For those of you with us in person, welcome to the Rotary Room. You should be able to respond or ask questions at the end of Paul. The microphone is on in that room, so just be mindful of that while you're in that space. For those of you with us virtually, we do ask that you mute your microphones during the presentation, and you can submit questions via the chat function or unmute yourselves at the end to ask questions of Paul if you would like to. If you get bumped out of the meeting, just follow that original link right back to us and you can get right back in. And live captioning or closed captioning is enabled, so you can certainly turn that on using the show captions button at the end in your menu bar. So today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the event. And with that, please welcome Dr. Paul Lasley, our speaker today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, the Genealogical Society. I appreciate being invited back. I'm not exactly sure how many years I have presented to the group, but I always enjoy sharing my thoughts and insights, as well as the questions and discussion at the end. So I thought today we should spend a bit of time linking history and genealogy together. And I think that this is a real opportunity to showcase how historical events impact tracing one's roots. And so I'm going to use as example the COVID pandemic that has impacted all of us in so many different ways, to record that for those who follow. And so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time linking social history and epochal events to our roots. So let's see if I can advance the slide. And I was able to do that. So I think all of us understand that genealogy is the study of families and family history and tracing our lineages. And Megan shared with me earlier that in October, you all watched a segment of Finding Your Roots. And I also am a fan of that program. But if you sort of analyze the content of Finding Your Roots, you'll discover that a large portion of that is, in fact, putting in context the family lineages that are discussed. And much of that focuses around family lineages and history and providing a historical context or a situation of the description of the culture, the society in which our ancestors came from. Some of the key questions that, in terms of a social context or a historical understanding, is what conditions led our ancestors to migrate? Why did they migrate? And what factors contributed to their choice about where to go? Oftentimes, our ancestors could have moved to several other parts of the New World. How did they end up coming to America? And why did they come to Iowa? Another part of that historical context could be what's known about their journeys, the hardships they encountered. And so I want to spend a bit of time tracing your roots to that historical context. Are we still doing okay?
Yep, I think we look good.
Okay, all right. I got a little static there, and I thought, well, maybe I'm going too fast. So stories can help bolster understanding of why we came to America. So I list some questions there, some common questions. As I read genealogical research, I'm always fascinated in questions about how and why did ancestors come to America. Stories provide context for lineages, and while lineages are terribly important, I oftentimes find the stories that are attached become more meaningful and relevant. Questions about how did Grandpa come to own this farm? Or did he lose the homestead during the Great Depression? Why is it that the family cemetery has so many baby graves? Questions about, and as many of you know, I'm a native of Missouri, which was a border state, but questions about how is it that two brothers fought on different sides during the Civil War? And I have that in my family lineage. Closer to home, to Boone County, where I own some property, what happened to our family when the coal mine closed, or what happened to the miners' families? Mining was a terribly important part of Boone County up until the Great Depression. But other questions that I think that I've ran across: is it true that Uncle Jack had to get married or go to jail? Did Grandpa have a gambling or drinking problem? I recently watched Jane Smiley's theater production of 1,000 Acres, and there it was about drug abuse and gambling and incest, and that provides context and understanding who we are and our roots. More contemporarily, questions about after signing up for the war, Uncle Carl never returned home. Well, why not? These are the sorts of examples of questions that emerge in understanding our lineage. And there may be dozens, there are probably hundreds of other questions that the group this morning could have. But these stories provide important historical understanding and context. So the importance of stories in understanding genealogy and adds depth to the historical records. So I sort of try to put this in the context of what were the big events that led to decisions to migrate. And I break that into two categories: the push factors. What forced people to relocate? Well, industrialization, especially in England and Western Europe, with the development of the loom, the mechanical loom displaced a lot of people that had for generations had been weavers. But we can look at other examples where mechanization and industrialization, and certainly in case of agriculture, the mechanical revolution in agriculture displaced lots of people that had been farmers for generations. War and conflict is often the root of why people seek safety. We find that in some cases people fled conscription. And in fact, I just was reading in the last few weeks about Russian young men that have fled Russia to other countries to avoid conscription into the military. Other examples that I'd put in that push factor are corruption and greed from land barons. And for those of you that can trace your roots back to Western Europe, in the period of the caste system, where many of our ancestors were impoverished serfs or tenants, during that period, many of them fled because they were being exploited by uh, the land barons, or the crown. Racism and other forms of discrimination have also contributed as push factors. And Iowa has historically received a number of religious sects or churches or faith communities. And of course, the most famous of those is the Amana colonies, that were created from people who fled persecution in Western Europe. But there are a number of other uh, communities in Iowa that were the result of being forced out of their home country. Um, we can talk about not only the uh, Amana colonies or the Anabaptist movement, but the pre-Marxist socialist communities such as Icaria, but also in cases of religious persecution and among various sects that fled theocracy in Great Britain. And so religious freedom has always been an important factor, which I include as that push factor. There are other reasons why people chose to migrate, and I call those pull factors, the attractive factors that cause people to pick up uh, their belongings and move. Certainly in the United States, cheap land was often described as the magnet that attracted people to the continent, but also contributed to the westward migration as more land was acquired and opened up for settlement. Um, in other cases, family members uh, followed uh, maybe an uncle or brother. Uh, and so if you look at migration, oftentimes it was a case of maybe a young man heading west or headed to this country. Um, Oftentimes it was in search of new opportunities. Most migration occurred as a community decision. So entire communities oftentimes made the decision to migrate. And across Iowa, you still see remnants of that with the Dutch communities, with the Swede community, with the German Lutheran communities. Oftentimes, people made a decision. So there was a band of people that got together and moved or migrated. Employment opportunities, the promises from land companies, from the railroads, and other industries that were seeking a need for labor was also a pull factor as people sought new opportunities. Now, oftentimes we would call these epochal events. And so I want to spend a bit of time talking about epochal events. And epochal events are those that are so important and significant that they usher in a new set of values and beliefs and behaviors. And I will come back to this, but I actually believe that the COVID pandemic of the last 3 years is an example of an epochal event. Now, if we think about epochal events in migration, and there are a number of them, but I just list a few that would add context for some of your ancestors' migration. Those of us with Irish roots, it was a potato famine in the mid 1800s that caused many Irish, what we now know as Irish Americans, to move to this country. Wars have always played a significant role as people, and we see that today. I'm not sure how many Ukrainian families are in Ames right now, but I know that there are a number of families in Ames that fled to this country because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Other examples of epochal events are economic collapse. And if one looks through history at economic collapse, there's a number of examples where people were doing well, but events came together in such a time that they lost their income, they lost their jobs, they lost their assets, and they essentially had to relocate or move somewhere else. We've already spent a bit of time on what I call religious schisms, but we see that has played a very significant role in understanding people's decisions to move. Today, we see wars and conflict over tribalism. There are some analysts that suggest that the United States is becoming more tribal. But if you look historically, conflict between ethnic and racial groups around the world have contributed to not only wars, but significantly to migration. Hunger has always been an issue. I'm very concerned about world hunger, particularly in the less developed countries. In Africa, we see the plight of hunger and the Ukraine Russian war shutting off food supplies. Here in Arizona, where I'm speaking from today, the drug wars that have contributed to massive in-migration from Central America looms very large. And I know that Congress and the president and others are trying to address this question of not only drugs contributing, but it's contributed to unsafe communities, and my people are fleeing across the border, oftentimes undocumented, but they are fleeing for their lives from Nicaragua, Guatemala, drug infested. So epochal events have always played a significant role in migration. Now let's talk about some of the epochal events in understanding Midwest migration. And I suppose you'd have to start with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, with that opened that we acquired this what we know as a Midwest today. Thomas Jefferson was charged with in Congress for going beyond the presidency in negotiating this large land purchase. It never materialized very much, but the fact is it was very controversial at the time that a president was buying up land without congressional authorization. But the Homestead Act follows a series of land disposal acts, but the Homestead Act of 1862 was a result of Abraham Lincoln was president. The South was in succession from the Union. So understanding Midwest migration, one has to understand the Civil War that divided the nation. But while it also divided the nation, it also gave the northern states the power to pass the Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres essentially for free if you lived on it for 5 years. If less than 5 years, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre. And over the years, I've talked to a number of Iowa farm families who can trace their land abstracts back to the Homestead Act, and probably some of our listeners today can do that as well. You know, there are a number of us that also have ancestors that left the Midwest in the gold rush to California. The opportunities to get rich, or at least perceptions of getting rich, led to migration westward. And things like the Great Depression of the 1930s caused some people to move westward because, and in other cases, rural to urban migration. Many farm families left the farm, and one has to look at World War One and World War II that really changed the complexity, the complexion of the Midwest. The old song from World War One. How are you going to keep them down on the farm when they've seen the lights of Paris? But we also, many of us have ancestors that served in either World War One or World War II, left rural places where we were raised and struck out for living in urban areas, never to return home. These are epochal events that provide context as you explore your family lineage to understand, well, how is it that they ended up living, hundreds, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away? Well, in a response to the changing dynamics of the Midwest culture. We can look at other events in our lifetime that has changed our culture. All of us have heard stories. Some of us may have experienced the Depression of the 1930s, but certainly that's been a very significant factor. The Vietnam War. When I was in graduate school, our graduate program had a number of Vietnam War veterans that were able to use the GI Bill to continue their education. Others of us will certainly remember or have heard stories of how World War II impacted our family lineage. In some cases, it resulted in what they call the ultimate sacrifice or death. A number of Midwestern youth, Iowa State University Memorial Union has a dedicated hall for veterans. Moving more contemporarily, the civil rights movement of the 1960s might be called an epochal event that changed the culture of America. I came to Iowa in 1981, just as the farm crisis was evolving, and I spent a good portion of my career dealing with the adverse impact of the farm crisis on farm families and rural communities. That changed many families. We had farm suicides, we had families breaking up. We've seen an erosion in community spirit and families as they struggled with the economic hardships of the 1980s. And I don't want to bore you with all the stories, but when I look back at my career in counseling farmers and farm families, some that were contemplating suicide because they could not find a way out. I had a very good friend who attempted suicide in the 1980s, and my story of the farm crisis will include those that felt trapped. The 9/11 bombings is an epochal event. Families that lost loved ones in that attack on America. Certainly, more contemporarily, the influx of international migrants into the state or into the Midwest has changed. If you look not only at the influx of international workers into the state as they marry and settle down, and I look at communities like Perry, Iowa, and Storm Lake, and Ottumwa. My niece married an undocumented worker in Missouri. So we have now. I have a great niece who is has allegiance both to uh, Missouri, but also to Mexico. Other epical events, and one that I think should be included, is the January 6th attempt to block the orderly transition of power, the January 6th insurrection. Our grandchildren and great grandchildren are going to want to know, where were you on January 6th? How did that impact our family? And certainly when you look at the number of law officers that were working in protecting the Capitol, and those that were killed, those are dramatic impacts. But in terms of understanding the culture that we live in, I think this is one of those that also needs to be documented. Now I want to turn to the experiences of the COVID pandemic. I argue that the experiences of the last 3 years will be retold over and over to future generations and will shape our future. Some of the key questions that I would encourage you to record right now: how did the pandemic affect your life? What things did you have to cope with? Not only just masking and social isolation, but children that couldn't go to school and homeschooling, um, issues of how things were postponed or canceled, such things as weddings and family reunions and high school graduations and funerals. I had a very good friend that died in the midst of the pandemic, and I was here in Arizona, and I was recently talking to the family. I said, I'm really sorry that I missed your dad's funeral. He was an important person in my life. And they said, well, Paul, that's okay, because we really didn't have much of a funeral because uh, the pandemic. We know Dad would have liked to have had a big funeral, but it was just too risky. Uh, Stories about how things change, how the COVID changed our daily interactions. Um, Working from home became a norm for many of us. So these are stories that provide context and understanding. So let's look at some of the impact of COVID in terms of people sought new ways to remain connected in spite of the social isolation. Now, I've argued that oftentimes the pandemic maybe accelerated many of the existing trends. I spend quite a bit of time working with voluntary associations and service clubs across the state, and COVID has taken a real toll on people attendance and participation in service clubs. Zoom has become a dominant form of meeting. Uh, and unfortunately, while the COVID pandemic has lessened, we now have the seasonal flu and the RSV virus floating around that people are. In fact, I understand that we're only a few weeks away from perhaps California implementing a face mask covering requirement, because, and I understand from reading the Des Moines Register that local hospitals right now are full of ill people. There are no beds, and I read the other day where walk-in clinics, you have to have an appointment now because they are so overburdened. These are all sort of part of the story of the pandemic. Workforce changes. working remote, people working from home, what we call telecommuting, hybrid classes. Uh, these are all how it's changed. Now, I had retired before hybrid classes came about because of the pandemic, but I've talked to my colleagues about the challenges of doing hybrid classes. Uh, and it's not without some consequence. In fact, I think part of what we're hearing now about the great resignation, people leaving the workforce uh, because of burnout. So, as you record, and I encourage each of you to provide these stories in your own biography. Uh, Not only will it help a recall when you're retelling these stories down the road, but it's so important for those generations that will follow. Uh, so, what I talk about here is putting life into genealogy uh, through the use of oral interviews. If I was a graduate student today, I'd be doing oral interviews of people that and their experiences of the pandemic. I think it's a treasure trove of understanding sort of community response and individual impacts to a to an alien virus that swept across the nation. But through oral interviews and diaries and farm or business records, census data, church records, photographs, newspapers can be supplemented with documented historical accounts to provide an understanding of who you are, your values and beliefs and behaviors. Being able to link one's personal biography to historical, large scale historical events provides the context, the situation to help us understand not only who we are, but how things evolved and emerged. So, the issue, for example, in much of Iowa, the railroads were emptying out the congested cities of the East Coast and the westward movement of people. Uh, I just was reading a few weeks ago about the orphan trains. In fact, I think there's a lecture coming up or maybe it's past, on the orphan train experience and the settlement of the adoption of orphan children out of the congested homes in foster homes in the east to the Midwest. People fleeing poverty of Appalachia, the rural urban migration that swept the country, especially following World War II. The Black migration of fleeing racism in the antebellum South, the Jim Crow South. The struggles of rural living before modernization, before there were U.S. post office or electricity, farm to market roads, the Dust Bowl, the farm crisis. There are so many things that have impacted not only us, but will impact our children and future generations. Some examples of those that tie those large-scale historical events to one's family biography. And these are some that I use as examples. Grandma always raised a big garden surrounded by zinnias. I guess that's why I do the same thing. Grandpa left farming after the war because his brother was a steel worker in Chicago, and Grandpa decided it was easier to make a living in a steel mill than farming. Other examples, after their mother died, the aunt took the kids in. He lost a farm during the Depression because of drought and grasshoppers. Or during the 1912 Spanish flu epidemic, they lost a child and an infant. a few years ago, I was in New Orleans and went on a tour. I actually got a personalized tour of one of the older above ground cemeteries in New Orleans. And I did not know, but the row graves actually date back to 1912, and most of them were infant graves. So the cemetery caregiver, since I was there before it actually officially opened, he was very glad to take me around and show me the infant graves that were created as a result of the flu epidemic in 1912. Other examples might include after losing their son in the Vietnam War, their marriage was never the same. That may be a story for one of the listeners today. Grandma always played the piano, and her siblings would join around the piano and sing church hymns. Provides context, the role of music, the role of family self-entertainment. Once the coal ran out and the mine closed for good, he had no choice but to find work elsewhere. And we're seeing that in certain parts of the country today. Questions about they were a good Catholic family, but for some reason they left the church. That provides understanding. This is one for my own family. They bought their first tractor in 1926 and sold the draft horses. I wish they'd have kept the draft horses. I never seen draft horses on our farm. With the holidays right around the corner, it's an opportune time to share these stories about how has the pandemic impacted you personally? How has the pandemic affected your loved ones? What do you perceive as the community consequences of the pandemic? We should record these stories, and I encourage you to record these stories now while it's still fresh in our mind. Not just to help us understand what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years, but for those who follow. With that, I want to close. I want to thank you and wish each of you happy holidays. And I think we now have time for a few questions or discussion. So if Megan's there, maybe you could tell me how I could close this off and I could see the group.
You should be able to, up at the top of your screen, see something that says stop sharing.
There it is. Oh, there we are. Hi, folks. I get to see you all. So I have talked for 45 minutes and you've been very kind and generous. So it's now time for us to have a discussion. Questions, comments?
The comments about churches and stuff during the pandemic. I know a lot of churches went to Zoom services and actually closed their in-service for people. And it's a struggle to get people back now once they've gotten used to the Zoom calls. And it's actually impacting the finances of churches.
Yes, thank you for the comment. Indeed, I provide some consultation to a number of churches and service clubs, and they're struggling. The habit of going to church in person once a week has been disrupted, and the question many churches are facing today is, will people come back, and how do they improve their financial after being closed. So my church, which is the United Church of Christ Congregational, downtown close to the post office, we were shuttered for something over a year. And not only is it an older church, but maintenance had been deferred for. So just getting the church physically ready. But as I talk to church leaders across the state, the disruption in breaking that pattern or that habit of coming together cooperatively in person once a week, it's a real question as to how many churches will be able to survive, especially in rural churches. I talked to a rural pastor in central Iowa a few weeks ago who serves two churches. And so I was asking about one had 8 attendees, the other had 12. And I said, well, you know, that's not enough to sustain. He says, no. He said, they're faced that question, do they close or not? So thank you for the comment. Other questions, comments, things that I should have included and didn't?
I think you mentioned this, but my husband's a professor, and so they had no students for a while after spring break, and then the students came back, but of course they have to make a lot of accommodations for students if they're sick or whatever. But because it's a hybrid class, my husband says, he's a professor, he says the kids don't come to class, there's only a few that come to class, the rest I'll pick it up, and he's, you know, he would rather they came to class, but and then they have to make lots of accommodations now because they got used to being accommodated because of
yes.
And so they just expect to be accommodated. Well, the professors get, you know, they kind of say, oh, no, I have more work because I have to accommodate every student.
Very good observations, you know, and the impact on education, and we're all seeing probably much of the same news about student performance and students that some excelled very well in online education and others have fallen behind. And I think across the state, we're seeing that student performance is lagging. And that's one of the important consequences. And how do we restore that? And but I think also one of the problems that I'm seeing crop up as a result of the pandemic is social isolation. And because people were, for a couple of years, were isolated, many people now have, especially young people, do not have the skills to engage. And we talk about social isolation, but I think it's actually loneliness. And I just seen a national study by the Pew Foundation that's reporting 20 to 30% of college students are experiencing anxiety and depression that they relate to social isolation and loneliness. These are big events that are going to affect families for years. And that's why I encourage you to record these and put those in your notebooks of genealogy as to, you know, how the pandemic changed how we engage with each other. Other questions or comments? I know we got a lot of people. I recognize several people, and I know that we got a lot of genealogy experts on. Other questions that or comments?
So businesses seem to be smaller now. Businesses seem to be smaller. They don't have as many jobs, don't have the workers. I don't know if that's related to the pandemic or not. They don't have as many workers to keep the restaurants open as late. And maybe that's a good thing that we just kind of go back to when there was, some days off or whatever.
Yeah, the issue of worker shortage and the great resignation, workers, the lack of workers, these are all related and they will impact us. And so these are important stories to record. Thank you for that observation.
The interstate road system that was developed, what was it, 52 when Eisenhower was president,
Yep.
and airline travel really affects because it makes it so easy to go from one place to another and maybe start a new life in a new country.
Yep. And certainly the interstate highway system, as you correctly point out, under the Eisenhower administration, certainly not only connected us, but it also not only did roads go in, but roads went out. And a lot of people used those roads to bypass their local supplier. I think their highway system, while it's really great, has taken a heavy toll on many small town Main Street businesses. People, the ease of travel. Now, maybe the pandemic has shifted that back. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. What I see a big change in shopping behavior are all the Amazon and the delivery trucks from online shopping. So many people are not going to the store. They're shopping on their iPads or their computers. And you see all these delivery trucks almost 24/7. But that's also because we got highway systems and we've created these massive distribution centers. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but some people are reluctant to shop personally, or maybe it's convenience. I'm not sure. Yeah, good observation. Interstate highways, especially the interstate highways that cut through family farms. And I've been involved in a number of those challenges over the years where people protested having their farm divided by a highway or interstate.
While we're writing in our journals, we should also remember climate change and the impact it's having right now on the water supply and beef cattle, for example, in Kansas. And they've been having to sell off much earlier at lower weights than they have in the past. And that's going to impact our prices at the grocery stores. So climate change also, in addition to COVID, is something we should be recording.
Indeed, thank you for raising that. Here in Arizona, I am acutely aware of how climate change is affecting water distribution, and out here in the desert, where it's only possible to live because we're importing water from elsewhere. But right here, where in Casa Grande, I'm seeing a number of farms going out of business. They're no longer raising irrigated crops, but they're becoming solar panel farms, and they're either selling a farm or leasing a farm because there's not water, but we have plenty of sunlight. And so that's certainly an epochal event. And I suspect we'll see that drought as it moves on eastward make similar sort of tough choices for individuals that are trying to farm in drought condition. In fact, I think I just seen this the last few days in the Ames paper. There's a major research grant out at Iowa State where researchers will be looking at the possibility of raising crops under solar panels. That's a result of climate change and the need for more energy.
I think it also means that the young people who want to continue the farming tradition may not be able to.
Right. Yep. and that really reflects some of the economic challenges that occurred during the farm crisis, where people could not make a living, and so they sold the farm, and that led to farm consolidation. So now we have fewer farms, but very large farms, and how that has changed the culture of many small agriculturally dependent communities. Indeed. Other questions or comments? Well, again, I want to thank you for having me. I would really prefer to be there face to face, but it is pretty nice to be in Arizona in the wintertime. But I want to thank the Ames Public Library, the Genealogical Society, for having me back again, and I want to wish all of you happy holidays. And I think Megan has posted the presentation, or it'll be available. But if there are things that you'd like to reach out to discuss with me or point out some flaws in my presentation, you've got the information there. Send me a note. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. I did put a link to the presentation in the chat, so if you didn't receive that, you can find it there. It's also available on our website, amespubliclibrary.org/genealogy plus. And we will see hopefully all of you next month on January 18th for Preserving Iowa's Food Traditions through the Iowa Community Cookbook Collection. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.